amazing session. I will just quickly introduce myself as well as the purpose of this speaker series. I'm hoping everybody can see my shared screen because I did not test that out myself. But you should see just 4 basic slides for this presentation. Hopefully you do. Please let me know if you don't. My name is Iris Buder. I am helping organize webinar sessions for the Association for Social Economics. We are conducting a webinar series this year, and in particular, we're going to have 4 different sessions in the upcoming year. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of background about the Association for Social Economics and would advise you, if you want to join this wonderful organization. The ASE was founded in 1941, and the aims of and the objective of the ASE are to foster research and publication centered on the reciprocal relationship between economics and broader questions of human dignity, ethical values, and social philosophy. The association strives to encourage the efforts of all scholars who are dedicated to exploring the ethical presuppositions and implications of economic analysis, and to consider the personal and social dimensions of economic problems, and to assist in formulating economic policies consistent with a concern for ethical values in a pluralistic community and the demands of personal dignity. Of course, our session is on racial capitalism and Black political economy today. And so I would like to provide a brief introduction to our wonderful speakers and our moderator. First, we have Dr. Rhonda Sharpe, who is the founder and president of the Women's Institutes for Science, Equity, and Race. She was named a Black Scholar You Should Know by thebestschools.org and blackenterprise.com. She is the co-editor of the Review of Black Political Economy and serves as the president of the National Economic Association. In 2020, she was selected to serve on the Center for American Progress National Advisory Council on eliminating the Black-white wealth gap. Dr. Sharpe's research focuses on 3 areas: gender and racial inequality, the diversity of STEM, and the demography of higher education. Her recent publications include, but are limited to, Disaggregating Data by Race Allows for More Accurate Research, and Is the Economics Knowledge Production Functions Constrained by Race in the USA? Her research has also been featured on the PBS NewsHour, in the New York Times, and on the Carrie Miller Show. She is a recurring guest on the BBC's Business Matters. Dr. Sharpe also serves on the boards of the International Association for Feminist Economics and Diversifying and Decolonizing Economics. She's also the co-founder with Sandy Darity of the Diversity Initiative for Tenure in Economics, for which she served as the associate director from 2008 to 2014. She's also the recipient of the 2004 Rhonda Williams Prize from the International Association for Feminist Economics, and has completed her undergraduate studies in mathematics at North Carolina Wesleyan College and her doctorate in economics/mathematics from Claremont Graduate University. We also have with us today Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nembhard, who will serve as our moderator, who is professor of Community Justice and Social Economic Development in the Department of Africana Studies, the director is director of the McNair Post-Baccalaureate Achievement Program at John Jay College, City University of New York. She's also an affiliate faculty member in the Environmental Psychology PhD program and the Economics Master's program, as well as faculty fellow and mentor with the Institute for Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing at Rutgers University School of Management and Labor Relations, and an affiliate scholar with the Center for the Study of Cooperatives. Professor Gordon-Nembhard is a political economist specializing in community economic development, solidarity economics, cooperative economics, Black political economy, and popular economic literacy. Sorry, please again, remember to mute yourself if you are entering our chat. Her research and numerous publications investigate problematics and alternative solutions in community economics, worker ownership, racial wealth inequality, community-based asset building, community-based approaches to justice, and the benefits to and impacts of cooperatives on communities, especially racialized communities such as Black, especially African American communities, and Latin communities. Dr. Jessica Gordon Nembhard also serves as the co-editor of Wealth Accumulation and Communities of Color and is author of African American Cooperatives and Sabotage, The Case for Reparations. She's also the recipient of several awards, the Association of Cooperative Educators 2021 Award for Outstanding Contribution to Cooperative Education and Training, the 2019 African Diaspora Celebration Citation for contributions to the New York City African Diaspora community, and also the 2017 CAC, there we go. Now it's back to being recorded.
So it's back on. So welcome everybody. Thanks to ASE for having us. We have a great, looks like a great participation, over 120 people. So thank you all for that. I'm very excited to moderate this and actually to hear our presenter. So I'm not going to talk too much, but I do have a little bit of an intro. I do want to start by acknowledging the original stewards of the land. So doing a land acknowledgement. I'm in New York City at the moment. So that's Lenape land, Lenape nations. You can acknowledge those wherever you are. I want to couple that with an ancestor acknowledgement, and especially to acknowledge my own ancestors and those enslaved laborers, those who continue to labor without just compensation, those who have struggled against anti-Blackness and used mutual aid and cooperative economics for liberation. And I also want to recognize our Black political economy ancestors and elders, and I think some of our speakers will probably mention them, but there's many of them actually, and we stand on their shoulders. In these times, it's really more important than ever and more obvious than ever that we really can't achieve racial equity or racial justice or gender justice without economic justice. African-American activism and rebellion often focused on and continues to focus on economic justice, not just civil rights justice. We saw that with the Black Panther Party. We also see it with the current movement for Black Lives, right? There was early realization that without economic democracy, economic equality, economic independence, and stability, that without those things, we wouldn't really achieve social or political rights. Those would be hollow or not achievable. So Black political economy is a field that has grown out of this acknowledgement and provides us with ways to understand and critique racial capitalism and to use applied economic theory as well as empirical analysis to understand the Black economic, political economic, and social economic experience, and to help us solve many of the problems created by structural racism and racial capitalism. So this panel will provide you with insights into these issues and a greater understanding of racial capitalism and Black political economy as a way to analyze and find solutions to these issues. So I think the order that we have of our speakers is going to be Dr. Leon Prieto, I think I pronounced that right. Prieto, I think it is, right? Then Dr. Rhonda Sharpe, and then Dr. Curtis Haynes, Jr., and then we'll come back and chat among ourselves and answer any questions. So let me turn it over to Dr. Prieto.
Thanks for the gracious introduction, and it's quite a pleasure to talk to you all today. So let me go on presentation mode. Let's see. All right, so I'm going to talk about the need to decolonize the curriculum and introducing students to Africana history and philosophy and racial capitalism and the Black political economy. And my background, I work at a business school, and So the things I like to research and talk about, it's not usually talked about much within business schools, within the scholarship that most business scholars tend to undertake, so I usually get strange looks, from a number of my colleagues, but that's fine. So a little bit about me, I'm originally from Trinidad and Tobago, came to the US, and I always had a very strong interest in Africana history and philosophies in general, and always tried to find ways to critique unbridled capitalism, right? So capitalism in its unbridled form, I believe, is contributing to the brokenness of our shared humanity. And during this critical juncture in human history, it's time for universities, especially business schools, to do more than just teach capitalism, right? Especially to demographics that oftentimes lack access to capital. And when I first started my career, um, I guess I was guilty of just teaching capitalism the traditional way. And I needed to critique myself and my pedagogy. And I decided to make a change, a couple of years into my career. So we need to utilize critical pedagogy and really encourage students to reimagine a more just and inclusive form of the capitalistic economic system. And we really need to encourage the future business leaders and their organizations to focus on social sustainability, human rights, and community well-being as much as they do profit, or maybe even more. So we really need to restore Africana or Black history into the university curricula, especially at business schools. And I believe that is one key step towards embracing and enhancing, the entrepreneurial self-efficacy and motivation of our Black students, especially. And very little attention has been paid to the histories of enterprise and management in general from Africa, as well as other nations in the global South. So there are a number of scholars today who are really questioning the lack of diversity within the canon because it relies so heavily on theories dominated by Anglo-American and European point of views, Eurocentric point of views. So the time is right now in order to decolonize the curriculum. And according to Dr. Charles W. Mills, who was recently deceased, he wrote this seminal book called The Racial Contract. He taught us that the social contract from its very inception, it was inherently racialized. And he posited that white supremacy fundamentally shaped how Western philosophical thinkers conceived humanity. So usually, the thoughts and the ideas of racialized people were deemed unsuitable. And because of this thinking, we are left with a mostly Eurocentric canon, and one that historically favored an economy structured around the racial exploitation of people of color, right? So Charles W. Mills, he made a very great contribution with his work. And as it relates to racial capitalism, it's important for us to draw upon the works of giants before us who oftentimes go unrecognized, like Dr. Oliver Cox. He's a countryman. I'm from Trinidad. He's from Trinidad and Tobago as well. And Dr. Cox, he basically argued that racial antagonism is part and parcel of the class struggle because it developed within the capitalist system as one of its fundamental traits. And then Cedric Robinson, he built upon the work of Oliver Cox, and he argued that racial capitalism depended on slavery, imperialism, violence and genocide. And when we examine some of these labor atrocities within global supply chains, we have to really ask ourselves and our students, have things really changed? Because in business schools, to be honest with you, we don't really engage our students enough about some of these labor atrocities within these global supply chains and the impact of racial capitalism. So we fall short a lot of times, and it's time for us to do better. And our students are not really challenged enough to really reflect on the capitalistic economic system and how it has derived economic and social value of the racial identity of others. And we have to really let them know about how this system resulted in, enslaved Africans experiencing social death, as argued by Dr. Orlando Patterson, based on his argument in his book, Slavery and Social Death. So many of our socially dead ancestors had no rights, their humanity was not respected, and that culture persisted and is currently reflected in the curriculum, because our contributions is non-existent. All right, so a powerful influence to me and the work I do trying to decolonize the curriculum is Ngugi Thiago and his book, Decolonize the Mind. And it's a powerful influence because it reminds us that Africana histories and philosophies are worthy and can help sustain Black communities. So in order to decolonize the curriculum, you must decolonize your mind first and foremost. And we need to re-engage with Ubuntu, Umuganda, Ujamaa, and other traditions of cooperation that can really help us facilitate a more communitarian approach to capitalism, one that will do a better job nourishing our shared humanity. So Ubuntu, it's a philosophy very prominent now. Got its start in South Africa, and one of the favorite philosophies of the late Desmond Tutu and the late Nelson Mandela. It embodies the spirit of cooperation within African societies, and it can be translated to mean "I am because we are." And according to Bangura, the three main tenets of Ubuntu are spirituality, dialogue, and consensus building. So from building on that foundation, myself and Phipps, we define cooperative advantage as the benefits that an organization possesses and accrues due to its people-centered approach to engendering a spirit of care and community, dialogue, and consensus building for the benefits of employees, customers, the community, and the entire value chain in general, right? So we are trying to encourage corporations to really adopt this whole philosophy of cooperative advantage. And we make the argument that in the golden age of Black business, which was from 1900 to 1930, and that was a term developed by Dr. Juliet Walker when she wrote a seminal work on Black business history. She found that African-American businesses during that time experienced a lot of success, a lot of goodwill. And myself and Phipps, we hypothesize that success. We hypothesize that success was engendered because of their practice of cooperative advantage. And this approach is based on, African philosophies of cooperation that survived the Middle Passage into the Americas. And many of it found its way into the Black businesses via the Black church and mutual aid societies, right? So many of the Black businesses during that point in time got their start from mutual aid societies and the Black church. So that whole philosophy of cooperation was embedded within their business model. So many of the early Black business pioneers practiced a more communitarian and a more just and inclusive form of capitalism. And as a student, I noticed a lot of gaps within the classes I was taking. Everything was from a Eurocentric or Anglo-American point of view. So I decided to do some work and try to address that gap. And, a lot of the philosophies and practices of Black business pioneers, which I believe are relevant, it was non-existent. So we can utilize critical pedagogy to really facilitate student empowerment, to create a more inclusive and more complete, a more comprehensive learning experience for our students, to really promote critical thinking, encourage them to focus not just on entrepreneurial success, but how do we engender social sustainability and social transformation in general? How do we create sustainable cities and communities? So decolonizing the curriculum can mean reimagine it as one that addresses pre-colonial Africa, slavery, capitalism, and modern management, the golden age of Black business, and alternative models of enterprise. So Africa is usually pretty much absent in many of the textbooks that we use, especially in the business schools, pretty much dismissed as a primitive continent. But we need to let our students aware of the fact that there were entrepreneurial societies within the continent, and they had their own philosophies and traditions that are worthy of discussion in the classroom. So Kalu Osiri, he wrote this paper on Igbo management philosophy. So the Igbo people of Nigeria, they have their own rich traditions that is worthy of discussion, that could help sustain communities. Then you got Chambi Chichaje. He wrote this very influential dissertation about entrepreneurial societies within Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And we need to talk about entrepreneurship within the context of Africa and how they build societies using their own indigenous forms of enterprise, right? So another example of a successful entrepreneur from Africa was Jaja Opobo. He built a large business empire in Nigeria. He received a lot of praise even from Europeans. But after the 1884 Berlin Conference partitioned Africa into various European nations, the British eventually arrested and exiled Jaja to the Caribbean. And this pattern of disrupting Black entrepreneurship, is arguably was a common one, as evidenced from Dr. Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. So we need to introduce students to past and current African business traditions and figures. And our courses need to explore the complexity of Black enterprise, as well as the disruptive forces of colonial power in the agency and growth of African entrepreneurship. And our students need to also grapple with the complex historical relationship of capitalism, race, and slavery, right? So another one of my countrymen, Dr. Eric Williams, he wrote Capitalism and Slavery. And that work was harshly criticized in England when he published it as a student at Oxford. He argued that slavery played a central role in the economic development of Europe, and that it was only abolished when it was no longer financially feasible and not primarily for humanitarian reasons, right? So his work was pretty much criticized, and only now in England they seem to accept his thesis. And also some of the works written by Bill Cook and Caitlin Rosenthal, which looks at the relationship between capitalism and slavery and modern management, and how modern management got its start from slavery as well. So Caitlin Rosenthal, she wrote this really interesting book called Accounting for Slavery, and how a number of current business practices got its start in the plantations during the days of slavery. So it's time for business schools to really wrestle with the role of chattel slavery and subjugation of Africans in fueling European and US economic advancement. And we also need to further examine the ties between capitalism and slavery, because as we know, racial capitalism is still very much a reality. And we really need to continue this cultural conversation about the intersection of capitalism, race, and slavery. Right. So and the golden age of Black business need to be addressed. A lot of the work I do revolves around Durham, North Carolina's Black Wall Street, and how Charles Clinton Spaulding, who was a Black business pioneer, who was nowhere present in any management textbooks, but now he's slowly being introduced. He helped transform his community, Durham, North Carolina, and his company, North Carolina Mutual, into an exemplary company, not just a Black business, but an exemplary business in general in American history. So he played a very critical role in the history of management. And pioneers like Charles Clinton Spaulding should be acknowledged. And there were others as well, like Magdalena Walker and Annie Turnbull Malone, many others. And Spaulding, he was known as Mr. Cooperation. And this is no surprise because many African communities really embrace this whole philosophy of cooperation. When W.E.B. Du Bois visited Durham in 1912, he praised Durham and the North Carolina Mutual in general for their emphasis on cooperation over capitalism. And Spalding had his own philosophies of management that he wrote because he was also a thought leader, and he also talked about the need for social service in business, and he emphasized his company's role as a social business focused on positively impacting the community and not just making a profit. So he pretty much conceptualized social entrepreneurship long before the word even came into existence. He was a pioneer as it relates to that. And our students in business schools, they learn nothing about so-called alternative models of enterprise. And I put it in parentheses because it shouldn't be the alternative, it should actually be the normative, right? So when we teach entrepreneurship, we never talk about cooperatives and cooperative economics in general, but we need to introduce that these forms of entrepreneurship within the curriculum and its relevance and how useful it was for African Americans. And I have to acknowledge the work of Dr. Jessica Gordon Nemhard, her book, Collective Courage. It definitely shaped the way many of us view Black economic cooperation. And also the work of Dr. Caroline Shanaz Hussein, The Black Social Economy in Americas. So their work and others should be covered because when business schools teach the histories of these approaches and explore their economic impact, this more comprehensive curriculum prepares students to respond to the challenges they may encounter. So at my center, we are trying to really try to create a culture that really embraces this whole cooperative model because our students are not exposed to it. And the thing is, business schools during the past did teach about cooperatives. So I first encountered Professor William Matney in Dr. Gordon Nemhard's book, Collective Courage. And I decided to explore the role he played within his business school and how that program came into being, etc. So I wrote this paper that was called Teaching Cooperative Business, and it examined the Bluefield experiment. It happened at Bluefield Colored Institute, which is an HBCU. And Du Bois, he helped William Matney really conceptualize how they're going to teach cooperative economics at an HBCU in the early 1920s, mid-20s, early 1930s. And he taught this model to the students. They were able to make a profit. They were able to fund scholarships for students. And they really developed a culture at Bluefield Colored Institute that revolves around cooperative economics. But unfortunately, that experiment came to a close because the state of West Virginia wanted them to end it. And I need to acknowledge some of the pioneers of the African-American cooperative movement, people like Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, Father Albert McKnight. These are all heroes of mine, and they should be introduced into the classrooms as well. The work they did was exemplary, but they were oftentimes labeled as communist or un-American. But when business schools teach the histories of these alternative approaches to enterprise, and fully explore their economic impact, this more comprehensive curriculum can better prepare our students to respond to the challenges they may face. So this is just a diagram to show the need to really introduce students to Africana history and philosophies and alternative models and how it may increase their entrepreneurial self-efficacy. So in conclusion, we really need to learn from this and expand the canon and really include some of these traditions and histories and these figures that have oftentimes gone unrecognized, right? So we need to really operationalize racial justice in the form of a more inclusive and complete curriculum, because there's an emancipatory power of having a decolonized curriculum. All right, so that's my talk, and hopefully I will be able to address some of your questions later on.
Thank you so much, and of course, thanks for the call out to my work. I really appreciate it, and your masterful essay on the Bluefield experiment. Thank you for that too. Hopefully, everybody will read it. We're going to move now to Dr. Sharpe.
Actually, I think Dr. Sharpe has a quick conflict. Dr. Curtis Haynes, do you, would you be able to present next for us?
Yes, I will.
Sorry
Great.
about the little switch up, but thank you so much.
Okay. Take it away, Dr. Haynes, and please, everybody else, mute yourself. Lawrence, can you mute yourself? Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the moderators and to the other speakers. Dr. Prieto, I mean, I really appreciate the work that you shared with us. I think that what I want to talk about a little bit is that what's going on right now. And pretty much the world is experiencing a shift of what I feel is like at an epoch level dimension, right? There's so many different things that are happening around the world right now. And these changes are forcing us to change in paradigms throughout all disciplines, right? And this is just as true in the field of economics. That we need a shift in paradigm, and we need a shift, and from my perspective, how we formulate economic concepts and practices in the field of economics to be more in line with what is happening in the 21st century. The kind of education that I received, right, I pretty much, like, I remember, right, the transformation to the me generation with Reaganomics, supply side economics, and trickle down economics, right? And it's clear that this 40-year experiment has disproportionately swayed financial and economic power into the uber rich, right? The cutback in regulations, the tax breaks favoring the rich, and the creation of financial derivatives that produce trillions of Wall Street dollars did little to trickle down to the main streets of America. Instead, right, industry went global, finance became secular, and the uber rich amassed an obscene amount of wealth. And amidst a revolution in the global technology, and there was a change in the spirit, there's this change in the spirits of men and women today also, right? But the socioeconomic conditions of the American working class and the middle income class and the working poor through all of this has almost stayed steady state, as the majority of Americans are doing their best to maintain, while abundance appears to be all around, but none of it is at our own kitchen tables. And today, the children of the working class and the middle income class and even the rich are recognizing the hypocrisy of the status quo that justifies the extreme wealth and income differentials that were generated during this late stage of industrial capitalism. But what we see, what's happening right now is that on the wings of a budding new age, right, a lot of the young folks are taking matters into their own hands, using a huge amount of intellectual energy and emotions, going into areas of creation and disrupting the status quo. I think about what's going on in the area of Bitcoin, for example, right? Disrupting the financial center and their monopoly power. Reddit and Robinhood and the trading platforms are being used to challenge Wall Street. Black Lives Matter is challenging the bigotry and institutional racism. And even the January 6th Capitol insurrection, right? All of these are signs of cracks in the norms and values of industrial capitalism of the 21st century that was born in the 18th century. And from my perspective, it is here that the Black political economy is ready to take its place, challenging the assumptions and values of much of the dominant paradigm in economics, and pave the way for what I feel, and other people, definitely the people on the panel, a way for a more humane and just socioeconomic environment with a perspective and a policy more fitting the change in epoch that we're experiencing now. The industrial age of capitalism is over, right? And the pendulum is swinging back to what we feel is what appears to be an early stage of a quantum leap in human potential, as the pendulum swings back from hyper individualism over the last 40 years to a more cooperative and collective actions. And the conditions of a paradigm shift are happening right now for all of us to see and for all of us to experience. Right. So my presentation here is the idea that my work, or the work in Black political economy, could be the bridge between economics of scarcity and economics of abundance. And this is just a particular perspective. So right here, this is Lloyd Hogan, right? And Lloyd Hogan, this is my mentor in the field of economics and political economy. Lloyd Hogan laid out a brilliant political economic analysis that synthesized the works of Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and W.E.B. Du Bois. And he was, in his day, he was inspired to respond to the absence of any significant economic analysis of the Black condition, over and beyond just the compiling of facts and figures and a straitjacket approach to economic policy. In fact, I would say, from my perspective, Lloyd Hogan committed academic suicide by not fulfilling the obligations of a PhD, by making the decision to study scientifically the social economic conditions of Black Americans while at the University of Chicago. That was unheard of. And from my perspective, Lloyd Hogan is one of the greatest political economists of the 20th century that many of you never have heard of, let alone study. Right here, we have the key to his work in his Principles of Black Political Economy, and his definition of political economy as the study of a human population undergoing the act of social reproduction over a protracted period of time under a set of rules promulgated and enforced by a political state within a bounded geographical domain. Now, I understand that that's a mouthful, but it is the foundation of analysis applied to an artificially created Black population, as W.B. Du Bois would call the so-called American Negro, during using the language of his time. This population was bounded together from a long common history of being free men and women on the African continent, with their lives being disrupted by a Holocaust of slave trade, Middle Passage, hundreds of years of chattel slavery, freeing themselves through their own efforts and other efforts, but caught up in a new form of bondage called sharecropping. And again, being freed both internally and externally through their own efforts, but landing into another political economic system of capitalism, primarily as wage laborers with very little opportunities to spin off a capitalist class, also in an environment of separate and unequal. I personally have come to use Black political economy as one of the tools to help me understand my own place in this world, helping me to understand that the poverty that I've seen, or that is being experienced in many Black and segregated and often ghettoized communities in the United States and throughout the world, is in direct correlation to centuries of wealth creation for others. But here's the paradigm shift. Okay, and I call it the bridge, right? So at the end of his book, The Principles of Black Political Economy, he says that in sum, Black Americans stand at the threshold of a worldwide social revolution. Their unique history of suffering and struggle for survival places them in an unparalleled position to be exemplars to the rest of exploited people of how a new social order can be conscientiously fashioned to reflect the perfectibility of the human condition here on earth. Okay, and right, to be exemplars to other exploited people around the world, right? Black Americans would have to learn to do for self, right? And Lloyd Hogan decreed, and again, like as Dr. Leon Prieto presented, there are so many people who have presented this idea of Black Americans needing to present and build their own safety net. And this is not new. And also going back to Du Bois, right, in the 1930s. My growing conviction has been since the Depression that the fundamental problem facing American Negroes is securing a place in American industrial life. I am certain if they simply wait to get their share in any change of plan and reorganization of economic life in America, the so-called race problem will show itself by making their entrance into the economy late and uncertain. And for that reason, I want Negroes to begin intelligent planning for themselves, not of course for a separate economy, but for the purpose of seeing how far their own efforts can help them towards economic security. Now, what myself and Dr. Gordon Nembhard have done is that we've kind of added in, a policy perspective to this Black political economy. And the policy perspective we call cooperative economics, right? And as always been alluded to already, Dr. Gordon Nembhard in her book, Collective Courage, lays out a history of economic cooperation in the Black community. And also what I'd like to say that was in the book, but also both of us looked at, is the role of the Mondragon, the cooperative complex in the Basque lands of Spain, as one of the greatest experiments in applied cooperative economics in the modern capitalist dominated geopolitical economic system. And through our work, we've considered it as a model that could be relevant in Black communities in the United States. And we add that and add our analysis as part of cooperative economic policy. And then my own work would looking at the intellectual contributions of W.E.B. Du Bois in the areas of cooperativism and cooperative economics. Du Bois has, he's been claimed by many different disciplines, sociology, the arts, and what have you. But Du Bois was also an economist. So we've come to see that Black political economy, cooperative economic policy, and community building practices are linked, right? And as an economist, what I would say that they are just as linked as, for example, neoclassical economics, right? The mainstream, the kind of economics that's been being taught in most of the colleges and universities throughout the United States. This form of economics it's a framework. It has a theoretical framework with a policy of laissez-faire, hands-off, right? And the actual application is profit maximization businesses. Or how about Keynesian economics with their general theory and their role of government intervention and fiscal monetary policy to respond to the socio-economic concerns of society. Or even Marxian dialectical and historical materialism and class analysis with policy orientated towards class struggle and the working class. Chancellor Williams, in his classic Rebirth of African Civilization, has reminded us, and so did Dr. Leon Prieto, right, that these are Eurocentric perspectives vying for the African mind, both on the continent and in the African diaspora. But they diverge from Black African culture of a long history of communalism and economic cooperation, not as ideology, but just as making common sense. Okay, so again, from our perspective, right, we developed a framework. I'm working on a framework of Black political economic in political economy and theory, cooperative economics and policy, and community building and practice. Okay. Let's see. Hold on a second. Okay. So just recently, Bob Proctor just passed away, but he was well known for his motivational speaking, and he talked about change your paradigm and change your mind. And what I'm sharing here is that, you know, we also are wanting to change our paradigm, right? Change our paradigm from, again, what I'm showing is this idea of economics of scarcity, right? The ideas, and again, these are the pillars of what I would call economics of scarcity. People like Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and John Maynard Keynes. But there's this other language that I call economics of abundance, and people who, like, I would consider like Neville Goddard or Bob Proctor or Napoleon Hill. Now, you know, my work in Black political economy, you know, I've considered significantly the Afrocentric forms of ancient Afrocentric thinking, right? But the Neville Goddard and Proctor and Napoleon Hill, they've taken this idea, this alternative way of thinking, right? That all is mind, and developed, you know, pretty much a lot of motivational aspects and actual concerns. And my own feeling, right, and my own practices, when I look at doing applied work and applied research in my community and motivating our communities, a lot of the work about concern for self, right? Self-actualization, self-confidence in our communities, especially with our young men and women, that's critical, right? And the language of Neville Goddard, for example, all is mind, right? That opens up this door for what I would call the economics of abundance. So from my perspective, right, the work of Lloyd Hogan, myself, Jessica, in cooperative economic policy can act as a bridge away from the concepts of scarcity that we've been taught for the last 250 years and practiced and built, right? I mean, the world is, you know, the economists talk about this world of scarcity, but the truth of the matter is that there's abundance all around us. There's the man-made institutions that have generated this idea of scarcity. So again, change your paradigm and change your life, right? And so, you know, I'm not going to go deep into the alternative paradigm that Lloyd Hogan has presented, but what I do want to speak a little bit about, you know, and again, I know there's a lot of economists who's on this call right now, and you're familiar with the neoclassical circular flow diagram, where you have the household, you have the firms, you have labor, you have income, you have prices, and you have goods and services. So what I want you to imagine, right, is that the household, right, if we look at the household not as just a site where people are just consumers, but that it's a site for production, right? And what's being produced, right? The human being is being produced. Human energy is being produced, right? Another thing that Lloyd Hogan has made in his contribution, especially, again, if we look at this neoclassical circular flow diagram, Lloyd Hogan designed what he called the institutional mechanisms of social reproduction. And the key components of it, again, is the household and the firms being considered as labor processes, the internal labor process in the household, the external labor process in what we call the firm. And then we have the labor for income, which in the capitalist economy is typically done through the market process, right? The labor is bought and sold in the market. Goods and services are bought and sold in the goods and service market. But Lloyd Hogan, in his Institutional Mechanisms of Social Reproduction, talks about well, in the modern capitalist economy, labor markets and goods and service markets, just as distributional mechanisms. Okay. So some of the key points that I feel using Black political economy, shifting us from the economics of scarcity to the economics of abundance. And I really feel that today in the 21st century, right, especially this post-pandemic period, right, that we really are experiencing a change in epoch. And we need a change in paradigm, a change in thought, a change in pedagogy, a change in practice that responds to what's going on in the 21st century. So some of the things that Lloyd Hogan has presented, right, that I feel that, again, you know, Lloyd Hogan was, you know, he was trained in also the materialist concepts of economics of scarcity, and I'm bouncing off of that into this field, what I call economics of abundance. But what's important in that transition, right, is the transition from the circular flow diagrams of the neoclassical model to this idea of institutional mechanisms of social reproduction, right? And me as a you know, I would consider myself as a micro-political economist, and I focus on what we talk about, we call the household in neoclassical economics, but in Black political economy or political economy in general, we call it the internal labor process, right? And so this internal labor process, right, is the way we look at it is that if you look at, for example, if you look at the firm, this is, you know, using neoclassical model, right? This is a production process where inputs are converted into outputs. Those of you who have taken some basic economics, right? You have the production function. Output is a function of capital and labor. An innovation of Lloyd Hogan was that the household was also a production function. Right? Inputs are converted into outputs, right? And what's being created? Well, for Hogan, what was being created, right, is human energy, right? And that human energy manifests in the human being, right? And the kind of language of Bob Proctor, Neville Goddard, right, Napoleon Hill, is that the human being has, you know, we have an opportunity to tap into our curious consciousness, our curious thinking. We have an opportunity to tap into our critical consciousness, our critical thinking, our creative consciousness, our creative thinking, our constructive consciousness and our constructive thinking, and building a political economic analysis that can house that and develop the framework and facilitate an analytical discussion and understanding of this idea of human energy and the human being, and shifting, you know, and those of you who are on the call who are not economists, what I'm talking about pretty much is shifting away from looking at economics and focusing our intellectual labor on the production and distribution of goods and services, and shifting it away to focusing on who we become as human beings, right? Shifting away from goods and services, material things, to the human being, okay? So a critical aspect, right, that Lloyd Hogan has done, right, is like right here, we have labor. A lot of the language of the economics of scarcity is about labor. Lloyd Hogan shifts his analysis from labor to human energy. Now, human energy, right, can also be considered just energy, right? That it's a particular manifestation of energy, right? Manifestation in the form of the human being, right? Another aspect that is critical from this paradigm shift from economics of scarcity to economics of abundance, using Black political economy as the bridge, is, again, as I said before, shifting from looking at the household and the associated consumerism to internal labor processes and the production of human energy in the human being. This is significant because if you think about it, right, the capitalist, right, used the production process. They converted resources, inputs to produce all the goods and services that we're familiar with right now, right? Galvanizing land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial skills to produce the goods and services. Now, going back to the internal labor process in the household, right now, I feel that we can be just as rigorous in organizing the conversion of inputs into outputs, so that if we want human beings who reach the heights of their human potential, the heights of their human productivity, that we have to do it in a very conscientious way. And Lloyd Hogan's and the principles of Black political economics opens up the door for that level of conversation. Also, when we talk about energy, right, human energy, in the Eastern thought, we talk about the Tao, right? We talk about prana, right? We talk about source energy, right? I think that right now, today in the 21st century, as we're moving into this new the manosphere, right? That we really pay specific attention to this idea of energy, right? Also, a lot of the economic models have been built off of Newtonian physics, but a lot of the language of the 21st century is we're moving more towards quantum physics. So Black political economy opens up the door from that transition from Newtonian physics to quantum physics, talking about vibrations, talking about frequencies, the human being as operating at different frequencies, different vibrations. Also the transition from material science to spiritual science, right? We've used physical science and we organize it in the form of physical technology, right? But the same rigor, right? If we think about the universe, right? The universe, some people talk about as chaos, right? But it's really a cosmos, right? And so it's like a lot of times, a lot of our work in the material world is chaos. But with right thinking or right consciousness, we could bring more cosmos into our actions and our practice. And I know that the language of the economists, especially the Eurocentric model of economics, to talk about spirituality, I mean, in the academic environment, we really don't talk about spirituality. But I think that for us to move forward in the 21st century, talking about spirituality, right, in a very rigorous way is very critical. And the transition, and lastly, again, moving from physical science and physical technology to taking seriously the idea of mental science and mental technology. So more insights, right? What is the new language, right? The new language is no longer is it about profit maximization and cost minimization. The young people of today's world, right, are looking to pursue their dreams, their goals, their desires and aspirations, or the success as a progressive realization of a worthy idea, right? Those can be brought into the fold of economic analysis, right? A lot of times we are influenced by these concepts of fear, doubt, insecurity, and indecision. But 21st century young men and women, right, what do we want, right? They want to be able to do what they love to do what they're good at, and make a contribution to the greater good and get them paid for that. Not the kind of wage peonage or debt peonage, or even the kind of economic exploitation of the 20th century, right? The idea of spirituality, tapping into spirit, inspiration, hunches, intuition, the use of visualization, imagination, intentionality, right? All of these are opens up a whole new perspective that will allow us to move into the 21st century. Louise Burleigh would say, your most important attitude is attitude of self. In my own work, I've discovered that as we try to introduce cooperative economic practices, that having supreme confidence in your own skills and your own self is critical to that process, right? So I'm going to close up right here and just give homage to Lloyd Hogan and his contribution to using Black political economy that I've moved on forward using as a transition from economics of scarcity to economics of abundance.
Oh, thank you so much. What a beautiful picture of you and Lloyd. Wow.
Thank you.
And any of you who know my book, now maybe you understand why one of the people I dedicated Collective Courage to is Curtis, because of he's just such an inspiring thinker. And he's really the one who even got me into this whole area of thinking. So thank you again, Curtis. Thanks for a wonderful presentation. Yeah. Rhonda, are we ready for Dr. Rhonda Sharpe?
I'm here, and thank you, Curtis, for filling in for me. Secretly, I really wanted to go last anyway, so I was saved by a repair person. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, but in the interim of figuring that all out, I want to take advantage of what Jessica has asked us to do, and that is to acknowledge, as the co-editor of the review of Black political economy. All right, I'm having some challenges here. You cannot see my screen, correct? Okay. I want to acknowledge Robert Brown, who is the founder of the review of Black political economy, and also say that there is I'm not sure what issue it is, but there is a piece written by Barbara Jones that is dedicated to Lloyd Hogan. I also want to thank Caroline Hussein for recommending me to ASE, and to ASE for extending these invitations for me to participate. I am one of those folks who's trained neoclassical, Keynesian, and so being pushed to think in a different way, entering into the space around heterodox lenses, which is going to be incredibly valuable for me and the work that we do at the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race, which is primarily to expand the way we have conversations around Asian, Black, Hispanic, Native American, and multiracial women. We want to expand women-focused research because so often when we hear women, they are not talking about Jessica and I, that they are more often talking about Iris. And I also want to say that I am in Henrico County, Virginia, and on our county seal is Pocahontas. Pocahontas is part of the Powhatan tribe, but the tribe that is associated, or the Native Americans that are associated with where I live, and hopefully I will pronounce this correctly, is the Algonquian tribe. But there's also the Pamunkey as well. And I think they're both in the county north of me, which is Hanover, and a little bit to the east in New Kent County. So the title of my talk is Racial Capitalism, Political Economy, and Vulnerability. At the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race, we have been thinking about vulnerability and a framework to measure vulnerability. Benga Ajilore, who is now a senior advisor for the USDA, tweeted, as you can see, this is in the first year of the pandemic, that says, who you center says a lot about who you value. And that has been heavily on my mind. As we think about vulnerability, we have been looking at the disaster literature. And the disaster literature basically says, look, disasters are not normal natural events, right? That they are a function of space, political power, who you are, and what the ways in which they define vulnerabilities are your ability to anticipate, cope, resist, and recover from a disaster. We are thinking a lot about vulnerability and how we should be thinking about solutions to public policy. So often conversations around public policy center the who and not necessarily the vulnerability. So one of the things that I'm very appreciative of right now in terms of being invited to think about racial capitalism and political economy, but more so racial capitalism, is what I think is missing in the disaster literature is the underlying reasons that may influence one's ability to anticipate, cope, resist, and recover from a disaster. And, you know, I think it's been said before, primarily, I missed a little bit of Curtis's, but I know that Leon said in his presentation, he referred to racial capitalism from Cedric Robinson. And then we also have a definition from Nancy Long. And then I also found some work by Tressie McMillan Cotton that in which she's using racial capitalism to think about internet technologies. And I wanted to pull up this sentence or quote this sentence because it talked about social relations, which I think is so important in terms of thinking about vulnerability, shifting the ways that we think about policy, and in this moment around COVID. McClure et al. Has a paper looking at racial capitalism and COVID-19, and in particular, how epidemiologists think about COVID and the ways in which they perpetuate this notion of risky behavior and health without thinking about the social structures that actually create it. And they have a statement that makes a reference to power and give the example of how doctors have incidents of COVID-19 cases that is reflective of the general population, but that is not what you see for essential workers who tend to be Black and Hispanic, especially if you're talking about low wage. And so I thought that, you know, as I was doing research to wrap my head around what was social capitalism, it seems like the piece that we've been missing as we're thinking about vulnerable populations. And like Curtis, we are thinking about what's the new framework for that. And in particular, what we are asking is that we shift from centering on the who and that we center on the vulnerability. And for some of you, you may ask, what's the difference in centering on the who versus centering on the vulnerability? And for us, the who is the characteristic that influences the vulnerability. And I also think that the who can actually be sometimes a barrier to getting a policy change. So if we hear that a policy may benefit a particular marginalized population, I think it makes it much easier for groups to organize to be in resistance to that. Versus if we center on the vulnerability. So an example of that for me is thinking about households that have lone earners. When I've asked that question, often what people will say to me is when they think about a lone earner, they think about a single parent household. And I have begun to remind people that a lone earner household can also be households in which one of the adults works and you have an adult that stays at home. And the response to that has been, yes, that is true, but people also see those households as households that have privilege, that there is privilege associated with being able to have one adult in the household work and one adult in the household stay at home. And I argue that that is still a vulnerable household. And the question is, when the adult who has been working should lose their job for whatever reason or lose their source of income, do we want those households to sell their assets in order to take care of their homes? And I must share that one person that I was having this conversation with was like, yes, we do. And I think that's worth exploring in terms of what that means for that household, and then also how they think about supporting policies in the future. So when we ask that we center on the vulnerability instead of the who, that is one potential reason why. So when we center on the vulnerability, what it allows us to do is to take into consideration characteristics of place and the individual, to think about the interplay, i.e. disaggregate the data by the characteristics that lived experiences and research has shown us influence an outcome. To think about the consequences. Is this, are the consequences of this vulnerability long-term or short-term? Because that influences policy recommendations. And then to also think about what are the commonalities across the vulnerable populations. And I think it is the commonalities that often underpin what should be the policy solutions. But I also think when we center on the vulnerability, it forces us to think about racial capitalism. It forces us to think about what historically have been the mechanisms to create this vulnerability. What are the ways in which capitalism, which is based on race, and I'd also argue in many instances gender, have created these systems, structural systems that allow people to be vulnerable, and more importantly, allow that vulnerability to vary across groups. So for us, shifting from the who to centering on vulnerability allows us to reframe the conversation, again, from the who to the vulnerability, which I think will provide for a more inclusive conversation, because again, with the lone earner household, even though we may not think about two adult households in which one person works, they may see themselves as vulnerable because there is one adult who works and one adult who stays at home. It allows us to disaggregate data, which we are really advocating for, because we believe that aggregate data allows inequality to hide, and it allows us to identify vulnerable populations and then tailor policy solutions for the groups that we're interested in. And it also allows us to craft policies to get at the vulnerability as opposed to the who. Thank you. So I think I was short enough to give us ample time perhaps for lots of questions. And again, I want to thank you for the invitation.
Thanks so much, Rhonda. Yeah, really appreciate that. I tried to bring gender in a little bit at the beginning with gender justice, and you returned us to gender also. So I'm excited about that. I don't know if I've seen any questions yet. Hopefully people have questions or comments, but meanwhile, I'll try to get us all talking with each other. I wanted to just summarize a little bit of what we heard, or what I heard. Definitely we got definitions of racial capitalism, Black political economy, race and gender, new terminology of abundance and human energy, as well as understanding and looking at vulnerability and agency. We also talked about self-critique, decolonizing our minds, and self-care. Brooke, can you mute yourself? Thank you. So we heard also about the need for self-critique, self-care, decolonizing our minds, and pivoting or shifting our paradigms, right, to thinking more about abundance and human energy, collectivism, and the notions, right, that political economy and Black political economy in particular are kind of the theories and the applied knowledge that can help us move forward to do that shifting of paradigms, and to really have the 21st century be a time where we address, right, all the problems of racial and gender capitalism and move forward into new, more positive relationships. And also a place for us to really, it reminds me, I think Curtis brought this up a couple of times, that really capitalism is a short, 200 or 300 year movement of imposed economic exploitation, but the whole human history is about cooperativism, collectivism, mutualism, and the development of human energy and abundance. And we need to bring that back. We need to reduce our alienation that capitalism has created, and embrace, cooperativism, the growth of ourselves as human beings toward human perfectibility. So do any of you want to add to my summary or have any questions for each other, anything like that, while we're waiting for some Q&A? Go ahead.
I have a question for
Rhonda.
Curtis. I was getting ready to type it. And for me, that is, Curtis, how do you see shifting from economic scarcity to economic abundance influencing policy recommendations?
You're muted.
There you go. Policy recommendations. I feel that like I recently did a paper on W.E.B. Du Bois and his work on cooperativism, right? And Du Bois, right? He, throughout his career, he made many shifts, right? But his perspective of the cooperative or some kind of cooperative action, particularly the cooperative enterprise, he held on to that throughout, right? But there was like right before he passed away, right before he went back to Ghana, right? He spoke about the idea of the cooperative, right? And the idea of quote, socialism. And he was saying that the cooperative, right, on its own would not survive, right? That it's really going to take some kind of government intervention, some kind of government support, or even like in terms of work we're doing, right? We here in Buffalo are working with a cooperative bank, right, called Seed Commons, right? And the aspect of using targeted, because you just mentioned recently the idea of aggregations, right? But the use of targeted income support for economic development in our urban communities would be very critical. I mean, I think about the kind of money that has gone into Afghanistan or gone into the various wars, right? That kind of income, that kind of wealth, that kind of money, if that money was, and again, not in the form necessarily of income transfers, but really building up, because wealth could take the form of both material things and human beings, right? But if we used fiscal and monetary policy to build up the human beings in our society with a consciousness of race and class, I think that's going to be critical.
But it seems to me that what you're at when you're shifting from scarcity to abundance, that feels like what so many people are fighting against, right? Like everything feels scarce. Mm-hmm. And so anytime you're asking for a policy change that distributes resources differently, there's pushback. So that's why I was wondering, like, how do you see shifting from this notion of scarcity to abundance impacting policy change, because it is very much what we're thinking on, right? As we're asking people to broaden their definition about who is a woman in research.
Right. So I would say that even more precisely, it's a consciousness change, right? So whether you are a policy person at the level of the federal government, or you're a policy person at the state, you're a policy person at the county or the city level, whether you're a policy person in the private sector, when I talk about the idea of abundance, I'm talking about a consciousness. I'm talking about the recognition, right, that we can build the road as we travel. So if you're a human being who's in the position of power in the halls of government, right, you could look at the world as the world is being half empty, or as the cup being half empty, or the cup is being half full, right? That's your choice, right? And your policy can reflect that. Right. So I would say that the major thing that I would suggest, right, with regard to that, is I'm talking about a consciousness, that we shift from a poverty consciousness to an abundance consciousness, right? So for example, right, when we fight poverty, right, that's different than building wealth, right? When we fight crime, that's different than building community. When we fight disease, that's different than building healthcare, right? Or building health, right? So I'm just talking about a consciousness in building our thinking process and our words and our actions in our environment around the idea of health, the idea of these positive contributions. My experience has been like working in the community that you know, there's so much insecurity in the minds and the actions of the young men and women that I deal with, right? And I feel that what these young men and women need, not even just them, all of us, right? We need to really be able to tap into a greater level of strength and self-confidence about ourselves and what we can do for the world.
And thank you for that. It is one of the comments that I have gotten about thinking about vulnerability, is that someone said to me that it centers on what communities don't have. Yeah. As opposed to, and I'm trying to figure out how to get people not to see vulnerability as a negative, but as that characteristic that we really want to address. So thank you for that.
Right, thank you.
Yeah, I was going to add, right, something similar. One of the things, you know, when Curtis and I first started thinking about abundance, that helped me was also even the notion of a solidarity economy, letting us see the assets that we are, right, the assets and the strengths, the resilience and the agency that we already have and that we already practice every day, right? So reminding people that we barter all the time, right? We're always making something out of nothing, right? The stone soup notion, that's a notion of abundance, right? Nobody had anything to eat, but one person had a potato, somebody had a part of an onion, somebody had a carrot, right? Somebody was able to bring water, and you made a soup that fed the whole community, right? So it's that kind of notion that let's look at what we do have, even if we are a marginalized, oppressed, exploited people, right? So that, you know, we have a relationship to systemic exploitation, but we also have agency as human beings and human energy that allows us to resist in positive, humane ways that help not only ourselves and our families, but other people. And so I try to remind people of those things that we already do, and then how can we do them better, right? Better, more collectively. How can the policies that we do want government to provide, how can those policies reflect what would support us in doing what we already do even better? How, you know, that kind of thing. So that's some of the thinking I have. It also leads me, I think Curtis started to answer the question about where does the capital come from for cooperatives? Are these entities that provide funding, or do members have to put in the capital? And what if they don't have any capital? And that's definitely an issue that comes up in co-ops, especially using co-ops with low wealth, low resourced people. But one of the great things about cooperative solidarity economics, mutual aid, is that you start where people are. People put in whatever they have. It's back to this notion of it's not a zero-sum game. It's everybody puts in something and everybody benefits, so that you're really leveraging what people can put in. In worker cooperatives, often the workers have no savings to put in, but it can be taken out of their pay. Right? In consumer cooperatives like buying clubs, people put in what they have, but leverage that by buying in bulk so that the prices for everybody are lower so they can afford to have more and then share that out. But also there is a role, and I think Curtis started to talk about that too, there's a role for government money and even philanthropy, as long as it's supporting what people are already doing, not telling them what to do, right? And supporting them to grow, learn together, grow, and provide what they need, not telling them what they need. And so I think, I actually wrote an article, I think we mentioned it in my bio, shoot, I never remember the titles of any of my stuff, but it's about reparations for the sabotage against cooperatives. And what I end with on there is that, right, most government money is our money, right? Either our money as Black folks because of our blood, sweat, and tears that didn't get compensated for, or all of us pay taxes, all of us are laborers, or most of us are laborers who don't get compensated equally for the work we do, right? So that money is ours. So what we need to do is not say we don't want it or that it's blood money. We need to say what we could do with it that would make a difference. And for me, in the co-op movement, putting pools of money, public money, into cooperative development, both into the the finance mechanisms that are non-extractive, like seed commons and other co-op banks and credit unions, but also putting money into co-op education, right? Because one of the biggest barriers to starting co-ops and doing them well is that we don't educate ourselves well enough about alternative models and how to make decisions together, how to operate democratically, how to solve problems together, how to address conflict, that kind of thing. So if we could use public money to do that, still have everybody put in what they can as the mutual aid model does, which is the basis of co-ops, but also add to that, then we could, right, we don't have to see it as a zero-sum game. We don't have to see it as people giving us money and forcing us to do something with it, but we're there from a position of power because we're in control, but we're using the money that's ours in the ways that support us better. I don't know, Curtis or Leon, did you want to add anything to that? Otherwise, there's another question I was going to do. Okay, so we also had a question about advice to young economists and PhD students who are trying to learn these things on their own, how to bring them to their department, how to prioritize them in their learning.
Well, I have to be honest, some departments wouldn't be receptive at all as it relates to this. They may say things like, well, you could pursue that after you obtain your PhD, etc. So there'll be a lot of pushback in some so-called traditional institutions and departments, but just approach things like a lifelong learner. So I didn't learn about the cooperative business model in business school. All of these came from my own self-study, me as a lifelong learner, being introduced to the works of Dr. Curtis Haynes and Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nemhart and others. So just approach this from a lifelong learning perspective, and then just add it to your skill set, to your toolbox of skills. That's the approach I would use.
Yeah, absolutely. I barely learned Black political economy in grad school. I'm not sure. I think we did it in the Third World Caucus, right, Curtis, on our own. I'm not sure we had it in any classes. And then Curtis actually wrote his thesis on Du Bois and Du Bois's economics, but I didn't even focus on that till later in my career. And I'm self-taught as a community economist. I'm self-taught as a cooperative economics specialist, and I'm self-taught in solidarity economics. None of that did I get in grad school, but I did study political economy in grad school, which helped me to understand how to do critical economic thinking.
Yeah, I would follow up on both what Leon and Jessica are saying, is that I know I personally, right, I mean, graduate school is very difficult for me until I think I was reading like Karl Marx and the theories of surplus value. And when I saw the theories of surplus value, I saw it was a literature review of mainstream economics during his day. And I'm like, oh, wow, okay. So he studied, right, what he wanted to destroy, right? And so I would say for you, right, it's like, no, don't be afraid of studying the mainstream paradigms, because you really need, I mean, you think about the art of war, right? You need to know your enemy, you need to know yourself, right? You need to know both, right? But so I would say that in terms of my own experience, and I agree, like falling in love with learning, being a lifelong learner, right? We're in the knowledge age, we're in the information age, and we have no choice to be lifelong learners. And a lot of my own work, just like Jessica, it has been self-taught. The formal mechanism of mainstream economics, whether it's neoclassical or Keynesian, right? They really did not speak to the communities that I was speaking to and that I was channeling, right?
And I'd like to chime in and say that I think this is the perfect time to be venturing out, because there are so many organizations being led by young folks, whether it's Decolonizing Economics. You can join ASE if you're not a member. And I know the International Association for Feminist Economists has a Young Scholars Group. And the purpose of that is to get folks together to begin to talk about a variety of topics so that they can build their knowledge. So I think, unlike most of us who are probably in the 90s PhDs, there weren't organizations that were really pushing against sort of the classical notions, in particular neoclassical, right? They didn't exist. So this is probably a good time, even if you can't get it in your department. There are groups on the outside that are really trying to get people to broaden the way that they think about economics.
Yeah, and I would add, as you said, feminist economics. I've also learned a lot from that. I barely learned that in grad school. But again, I realized as I moved on in life that I needed to learn about that too, because it also helped me to understand solidarity economics and cooperative economics and that relationship to values-based economics. I think feminist economics first introduced me to that notion, right? Black political economy sort of first introduced me to applied knowledge and solution building, and then feminist economics, you know, opened me up to this understanding about values-based economics and values-based business development, and how we undervalue certain labor and stuff, which is actually what Lloyd Hogan also said. If you go back and read Lloyd Hogan, that there's so much labor and human exertion that's undervalued in traditional economics. That's another part of the paradigm we have to change, right? Is to look at all the places where we do create and can create and should be recognized for creating value, not just the commodified world that neoclassical economics creates and looks at. So really just that, keep putting your head, right, that critical self-analysis and continuous learning, I think really can help anybody to start to embrace these things. And once you start talking about them, you might even find some people in your own department who are interested in this. You know, you write a paper about it and see how some of your faculty respond to it, that kind of thing. And if they don't, find outsiders. I mean, I think all of us are on committees for other people's, other schools, other dissertations, because they don't have as many people in their own program for what they want, or you just do what you need to do to get the PhD and then you branch out. Did we have other questions? I think I lost track. How are we doing, Iris? And then
We have one more question,
okay,
if you don't mind. The question asks, could you touch on how cooperative leadership and government work? Is it democratic or representative?
oh, well, in cooperative businesses, in cooperative ownership, it's democratic. It's one of the major sort of pillars, or what we call international principles of cooperation. Unfortunately, not all cooperatives operate. Some cooperatives actually do operate with representative democracy, so the democracy is a little bit more in name and not in practice. But a lot of co-ops, especially community-owned co-ops, worker co-ops, take very seriously that democratic participation, the one person, one vote, and make sure to find ways to be very transparent and informational, because remember, another principle of cooperatives is continuous education, and that learning and joint learning so that they combine sort of those notions of democracy and joint learning and joint decision making to try to make them very participatory as much as possible. But there is definitely a range in co-ops. Like if you have the Land of Lakes, which is a huge agricultural cooperative owned by dairy farmers, right? First of all, they're not very cooperative or democratic with their own employees, right? The democracy is among the landowners, the dairy farmer owners, but they're, but they vote on a board of directors who then makes decisions, but they all have a vote on the board of directors. Or you could go to a very progressive worker co-op like Lusty Ladies, who were, I mean, they went under recently, but they were peep show dancers who owned the company with the bouncers and the janitors. And they practiced what's called governance by committee, self-governance by committee. So every owner is also a board member, and every board member is on some committee. They also rotated the management and supervisor positions and that kind of thing. So they were totally democratic organization among the three kinds of owners and within even the dancers. And then even the work, right? Who got to dance in what kind of window and when, and who got what hours and how much money was all democratically decided and equally distributed. So you have that gamut.
All right, well, I think we are at time. I again want to extend my sincere thankfulness to all our speakers and our wonderful moderators. So thank you, Dr. Leon Prieto. Thank you, Dr. Curtis Haynes Jr. And thank you, Dr. Rhonda Sharpe, for wonderful presentations. And also, especially thank you, Dr. Jessica Norden-Nemhard, for your wonderful moderation of this panel. I learned so much. As a reminder, we will be posting this session on the ASE YouTube channel. And for those interested, we will be having our April session, ASE webinar session, which will be on an interdisciplinary conversation, Feminists on Global Development and Being Free, which will be held via Zoom April 29th. So I hope you can join us there. So once again, thank you all so much. I appreciate your time, your willingness, and all the ideas that were shared today.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great week.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Ryan. Bye.
Bye.